Yet greed alone doesn't explain the sheer scale of her crimes. This wasn't one or two murders. This was systematic, clinical. Hundreds of lives snuffed out with a strip of white tape. At some point, Amelia crossed a line that few human beings can even imagine. The question is, what happened to her humanity? Some experts believe Amelia was a psychopath, cold, calculating, utterly devoid of empathy. Others argue she was a product of her time, shaped by a society that punished women for bearing children out of wedlock and left the poor to fend for themselves. In a world that treated infants as disposable and unmarried mothers as outcasts, perhaps Amelia simply took the cruelty of Victorian England to its logical extreme. And then there is the question of mental illness. Amelia had been institutionalized before. Records show she spent time in asylums, claiming to hear voices, to suffer breakdowns. Was it an act, a convenient way to escape consequences? Or was she truly battling demons in her mind? Some reports suggest her stays in asylums were suspiciously timed, often coinciding with moments when suspicion of her activities grew too strong. If that's true, then her madness was a mask, and behind it lurked something even more terrifying, a perfectly sane killer who knew exactly what she was doing. But there's another, more haunting possibility, that Amelia didn't just kill for money. That, over time, the act itself became part of her identity, her power. Imagine holding life in your hands, tiny, fragile, utterly dependent, and knowing you can snuff it out with a single movement. That kind of control can intoxicate. It can consume. Did Amelia begin to see herself as something more than human? A god, deciding who lived and who died? We'll never know for sure. She left no confessions, no diaries, no glimpses into the storm that raged, or perhaps whispered inside her. What we do know is this. Amelia Dyer killed not in a moment of passion, not in blind rage, but with calm deliberation, over and over, for decades. And that is what makes her story so chilling. Monsters that kill in a frenzy, we can almost understand. But monsters who kill for profit with cold precision, that is a darkness far harder to fathom. As the clock ticked down to Amelia's final hour, the world speculated endlessly about her motives. Newspapers ran lurid theories. Clergymen preached sermons about sin and greed. Psychologists dissected her character, searching for clues. But in the end, the truth died with her on the gallows. And perhaps that's the most unsettling thing of all, not what we know about Amelia Dyer, but what we don't. The date was June 10th, 1896. The walls of Newgate Prison loomed heavy with history. But that morning, they held a weight darker than any other. The presence of Amelia Dyer, the woman who had haunted the dreams of a nation. Outside, crowds gathered, murmuring in grim anticipation. The newspapers had fueled the frenzy with every sordid detail, and now the public wanted closure. They wanted to see justice done. Inside the prison, the atmosphere was tense but methodical. Execution mornings always followed a ritual, and Amelia's would be no different, at least on the surface. But for those who worked within those stone walls, this was no ordinary hanging. This was the end of one of the most prolific serial killers in British history. At 6 a.m., Amelia awoke in her cell. The records say she was calm, eerily calm, in fact. The woman who had taken hundreds of lives with her own hands now faced the gallows, and yet there was no screaming, no pleading for mercy. She dressed in black, the color of mourning, though not for her victims, but perhaps for herself. A prison chaplain offered her spiritual comfort, reading prayers aloud. But Amelia listened in silence. Some said she showed no sign of remorse, no flicker of guilt. Others claimed there was a faint tremor in her hands as she clasped them together. Was it fear, or something else entirely? At 8 a.m., the guards escorted her to the execution chamber. The walk was short, but for Amelia it was the longest journey she would ever take. Her steps echoed against the cold stone floor as the hangman, James Billington, prepared the gallows. Billington was no stranger to death. He had executed countless criminals before, but even he admitted later that Amelia's hanging carried a strange weight, as if the air itself thickened with the enormity of her crimes. When Amelia reached the gallows, she stood still as the noose was placed around her neck. The chaplain murmured a final prayer. "May God have mercy on your soul." Those were the last words she heard. At precisely 9 a.m., the lever was pulled. The trapdoor opened, and Amelia Dyer dropped into eternity. It introduced protections for children that had never existed before. Laws against neglect, mandatory registration of adoptions, and powers for authorities to inspect foster homes. It was a monumental step forward, born from the ashes of Amelia Dyer's crimes. But for many it was too little, too late. No law could bring back the hundreds of tiny lives lost to greed and cruelty. In the quiet corners of Reading, life moved on, or at least it tried to. The rivers flowed as they always had, indifferent to the horrors they had once concealed. The houses where Amelia lived were eventually sold, their walls bearing silent witness to the cries that had once echoed there. People walked past them with quickened steps, averting their eyes, as though looking too long might summon the darkness back. Yet, Amelia's story never truly faded. It seeped into the culture, the folklore, the nightmares of a generation. Parents told their children tales of the baby farmer as a cautionary warning. Penny dreadfuls and sensational novels turned her into a villain of almost mythical proportions. Even today, historians argue over the true scale of her crimes. Was it 40 babies? 100? 200? Some say even 400. The number is a ghost, always out of reach, always haunting. What we do know is this: Amelia Dyer changed Britain. She forced a nation to confront the ugliest corners of its society. The poverty, the desperation, the blind trust that allowed evil to thrive. She exposed the fragility of innocence and the failure of a system that should have protected it. And she left behind a legacy written not in words, but in laws. Laws meant to ensure that no child would ever again be abandoned to the mercy of a monster. But perhaps the most chilling legacy of all is the question that lingers still, more than a century later. How many Amelias were there? How many women walked the same path, unnoticed, unpunished, their crimes sinking into silence like stones in a river? We will never know. And maybe that is the real horror, that Amelia Dyer was not an isolated evil, but a symptom of something deeper, something darker, lurking in the cracks of Victorian society. As the camera pans over the gray waters of the Thames, we are left with an image. A ribbon of white tape floating downstream, a silent echo of the hundreds of tiny voices that will never be heard. The story of Amelia Dyer is over, but the warning it carries will never die. The trial was over, the verdict delivered, and the noose prepared. But as Amelia Dyer sat in her cell awaiting execution, one question echoed across the nation. Why? Why would an ordinary woman, a nurse, a mother, a grandmother, become the architect of such horror? What drove her to take hundreds of innocent lives? Was it madness, or something far more chilling? To understand Amelia, we must look beyond the headlines, beyond the courtroom sketches and sensational stories. We must step into the shadows of her life, into the mind of a woman shaped by poverty, tragedy, and greed. Amelia Dyer was born Amelia Hobley in 1837, the daughter of a shoemaker in a small English village. Her childhood was harsh, marked by poverty and the brutal realities of Victorian life. When she was still young, her mother succumbed to mental illness, leaving Amelia to care for her in a state of relentless suffering. The experience scarred her deeply. She watched helplessly as her mother descended into madness, screaming and lashing out until death finally claimed her. Some say this early exposure to insanity planted seeds that would later bloom in the darkest way. As Amelia grew older, she trained as a nurse, a profession that gave her access to something she would one day weaponize: the trust of vulnerable women. Nursing also exposed her to death, stripping it of its mystery and fear. To Amelia, life and death became transactions, processes, things to manage rather than sacred boundaries. But it wasn't until Amelia entered the business of baby farming that her descent into infamy began. In Victorian England, baby farming was shockingly common. Unmarried mothers, shunned by society and left with few options, would pay women like Amelia to take their babies, either temporarily or permanently. In theory, the children were to be cared for, raised in loving homes. In practice, many baby farmers saw them as little more than a source of income. Some neglected the infants until they died of starvation or disease. Others, like Amelia, took a far more direct approach. Why did Amelia choose murder? For one reason above all: money. To her, babies were a business. Each child represented a payment, a quick profit. £10, sometimes more, for every tiny life handed over. But feeding, clothing, and housing those babies would eat into her earnings. And so, in Amelia's mind, the equation was simple: kill the baby, keep the money, move on to the next desperate mother. As the execution date drew closer, June 10, 1896, crowds gathered outside Holloway Prison, chanting, shouting, demanding to see the woman who had become a living nightmare. Some came out of anger, others out of curiosity, but all wanted a glimpse of history's most notorious baby farmer before the rope claimed her. And what of Amelia in those final days? Reports suggest she showed little emotion. She ate well, spoke politely to the warders, and even hummed hymns under her breath. If she felt remorse, she never showed it. If she feared death, she hid it well. When asked if she had anything to say before her execution, her reply was chilling in its simplicity: "I have nothing to say." And with that, the woman who had taken so many voices silenced her own. But the story didn't end at the gallows. Amelia's crimes would echo far beyond that courtroom, sending shockwaves through society and forcing a nation to confront its darkest truths. When the executioner's lever fell and Amelia Dyer's life ended, many thought the horror had ended too. But the truth was, her shadow lingered long after the rope stopped swaying. Across Britain, fear rippled through every town and city. Newspapers splashed her story on every front page, and the name Amelia Dyer became a symbol of everything people dreaded but never dared to imagine: that evil could wear the face of a kindly old woman, that the warm promise of care could mask the cold reality of murder. For days after the execution, people crowded outside newspaper offices waiting for fresh details. Every new revelation, another letter, another witness, another suspected victim, fed the frenzy. Headlines screamed words like "the monster of reading" and "the angel of death." Pamphlets sold in the streets carried grotesque illustrations of babies' bodies floating in rivers, wrapped in brown paper. Parents shuddered as they tucked their children into bed. Mothers stared at their newborns with renewed protectiveness, vowing never to let them out of their sight. But fear was not the only thing spreading. Anger was, too. How had this been allowed to happen? How could one woman kill, not once, not twice, but over and over again, for years, without being stopped? The public demanded answers, and soon those questions turned into outrage against the very system meant to protect the innocent. Letters poured into newspapers and Parliament, condemning the lack of oversight. People were horrified to learn that baby farming, the practice of paying someone to adopt or foster your child, was not only legal but barely regulated. There were no proper checks, no follow-ups, no guarantees of safety. All it took was a signature on a piece of paper, and your child could vanish forever. Amelia Dyer had exploited this loophole with chilling precision, and the country now realized that she was not alone. There were whispers of other women, other farms, other babies who had disappeared without trace. The thought was unbearable. The government had no choice but to act. Within weeks of Amelia's execution, debates raged in Parliament. Politicians called for stricter laws, tighter control over adoptions, and harsher penalties for neglect and abuse. The old, vague system of private arrangements between mothers and baby farmers was condemned as a breeding ground for crime. New measures were proposed. Every foster home should be inspected, every child registered, every transaction documented. It was the beginning of a movement that would eventually reshape child welfare in Britain. But change came slowly, and in the meantime, panic gripped the streets. Police stations reported a surge in abandoned infants as desperate mothers, too afraid to trust anyone, left their babies on church steps or tied to orphanage gates. Charitable homes overflowed, and newspapers ran heart-wrenching stories of unwanted babies found in baskets, wrapped in nothing but rags. The nation had been shaken awake to a truth it had long ignored: the plight of poor, single mothers left with no choices but despair. And then there were the rumors. Always the rumors. People swore they saw Amelia's ghost near the Thames, a figure in a black bonnet, cradling a bundle in her arms. Others claimed she had an accomplice who escaped justice, still lurking in the shadows, ready to strike again. Every report of a missing child sent shivers down spines. Every package floating in the river sparked terror. For years her name was whispered like a curse, a warning to mothers. Choose carefully, for not every smile hides kindness. As the months passed, the reforms began to take shape. The Children's Act of 1908, often called the Children's Charter, was one of the most significant outcomes, though it came years later. As the executioner cleared the gallows and the crowds outside dispersed, Britain tried to return to normal life. But something had changed. The case of Amelia Dyer had exposed a terrible truth: that in the cracks of society, in the silence of shame, monsters can grow, and sometimes those monsters are not men but women, dressed in aprons and smiles, promising to keep your child safe. When the courtroom doors swung open, the world finally came face to face with the woman who had haunted their nightmares for weeks. Amelia Dyer, the baby farmer of Reading, walked in quietly, her plain black dress hanging loosely from her frame. Her gray hair was neatly pinned beneath a bonnet, her face pale and expressionless. If you expected to see a monster, you would have been disappointed. There were no horns, no wild eyes, just an old woman who looked more like someone's grandmother than one of the most prolific killers in history. And perhaps that was the most unsettling thing of all. The trial began on May 22, 1896, and from the start, it was clear this would be no ordinary case. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, onlookers, and officials, all crammed into every corner, eager to witness the fall of a woman who had become the most hated figure in Britain. Every seat was taken, and those who couldn't find a place stood shoulder to shoulder at the back, craning their necks for a glimpse of the accused. The air was thick with tension and whispers, punctuated only by the scratching of pens as journalists prepared to send shockwaves across the nation. The prosecution wasted no time in painting a damning picture. They began by detailing the grim discoveries along the Thames: the small, lifeless bodies, the handkerchief with Amelia's address, the brown paper wrappings that carried her name. Each piece of evidence was like a hammer blow, and with every word, the crowd shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Then came the letters, the advertisements Amelia had placed in newspapers, luring desperate mothers with promises of a loving home for their children. The words were read aloud in court, and they sounded almost sweet, almost kind. Married couple with no family would adopt healthy child, nice country home, terms £10. But beneath those words lurked betrayal and death. Mothers had believed her. They had handed over their babies and their trust, only to lose both forever. Witness after witness stepped forward. Some were former lodgers who spoke of strange smells, of crying babies who vanished overnight. Others were mothers who had come dangerously close to handing their children to Amelia, but changed their minds at the last moment, a decision that had likely saved their lives. One woman, her voice trembling, told the court how she received a letter from Amelia saying her baby had died of natural causes. But now, hearing the truth, she broke down, sobbing so hard the judge had to call for order. And then came the most damning testimony of all, the medical evidence. Experts confirmed what the police had suspected from the beginning. These children had not died of illness or accident. They had been strangled, deliberately and efficiently. Around their tiny necks, impressions of white tape had been found, the same tape Amelia Dyer kept in her sewing box. That detail would forever be etched into history. White tape meant death. The defense tried desperately to argue that Amelia was insane, that her mind had been broken by years of hardship and loss. They spoke of her troubled past, of her time in mental asylums, of the strain of poverty. But the prosecution countered with cold precision. Amelia was not insane. She was calculating. She knew what she was doing, and she did it for one reason only: money. Throughout it all, Amelia sat almost motionless. She listened, her hands folded in her lap, her face betraying nothing. When asked to plead, she spoke just 2 words in a calm, almost weary voice. "Guilty, my lord." Those words sent a shiver through the courtroom. No denial, no excuses, just an admission that sealed her fate. The jury took less than 5 minutes to deliver their verdict. Guilty of murder. The sentence was death by hanging. When the judge pronounced it, a hush fell over the courtroom. And then, slowly, a murmur rose, a sound that was part relief, part horror. Relief that justice would be served, horror at the sheer magnitude of what had been revealed. But outside those walls, the story was far from over. The newspapers seized on every detail, turning the trial into a national obsession. Sketch artists drew chilling portraits of Amelia, her sharp eyes glaring from beneath her bonnet. Pamphlets and penny dreadfuls hit the streets, sensationalizing her crimes for a public that couldn't get enough of the grisly tale. Some even called her the ogress of reading, a creature from a dark fairy tale come to life. And then they laid before the jury the most damning piece of all, the parcel that had started it all, the body of little Helena Fry, retrieved from the river. One by one, the witnesses took the stand. A boatman described the moment he hauled the package from the water, thinking at first it was rubbish, only to recoil in horror when he saw what was inside. A police officer testified about the stench in Amelia's house, the grim discovery of baby clothes by the dozen, the opium mixtures. And then came the mothers, women who had written to Amelia in trust, who had handed over their babies believing they were giving them a chance at life. Their testimonies broke the courtroom's composure. Grown men wept openly as the mothers described how Amelia had smiled at them, how she had promised care and kindness, how she had taken their money and their children, never to be seen again. But if the prosecution's case was devastating, Amelia's defense was almost non-existent. Her lawyer tried to argue that she was insane, that no sane person could commit such atrocities. He spoke of her troubled past, of her stays in asylums, of the mental strain of poverty and loss. But when Amelia herself was questioned, any hope of sympathy vanished. Her answers were cold, clipped, and devoid of emotion. When asked why she used the tape, she replied simply, "That was how you could tell it was mine." The words sent a shiver through the courtroom. It was not the response of a mad woman. It was the response of someone who had turned murder into a method. The most shocking moment of the trial came when the number of possible victims was raised. The prosecution suggested dozens, perhaps hundreds. The press speculated wildly: 50, 100, even 400 infants. Amelia refused to confirm or deny. When pressed, she shrugged and said, "You'll know in time." The ambiguity only deepened the horror. The jury was not just judging a murderer, they were judging a monster without measure. For all the drama, the outcome was never in doubt. After 5 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for just 4.5 minutes. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous: guilty of willful murder. The judge, his voice heavy with condemnation, sentenced Amelia Dyer to death by hanging. As the words rang through the courtroom, there was no gasp, no cry from the condemned woman. She simply bowed her head slightly, as if acknowledging a trivial formality. Outside, the crowds erupted. Some cheered, others wept. Many simply stood in silence, struggling to comprehend the scale of the evil that had been revealed. The newspapers called it the most shocking case of the century. Headlines screamed, "The Angel of Death," "The Woman Who Slaughtered Innocents." Every home in Britain seemed to talk of nothing else. How had she done it? How had she killed so many for so long without being stopped? And what did it say about a society that allowed such horrors to flourish in the shadows? Amelia was taken back to her cell to await execution. The prison chaplain visited her daily, urging her to confess, to seek forgiveness. At first, she said little. Then slowly she began to talk. Not in detail, never admitting to the true number, but enough to freeze the blood of those who heard her words. "I suppose I must have killed them all," she said once, almost casually. And then, "I'm not going to say how many." It was as if the mystery gave her a final, perverse satisfaction. On the morning of June 10th, 1896, Amelia Dyer was led from her cell to the gallows at Newgate Prison. She wore a plain black dress, the same composure on her face that she had worn throughout the trial. As the hangman prepared the noose, she uttered no final confession, no plea for mercy. Her last words were simple: "I have nothing to say." Moments later, the trapdoor opened, and the life of Britain's most prolific child killer came to an abrupt and merciful end. But while Amelia's life ended that day, her crimes did not fade so easily. The newspapers continued to print lurid details for weeks. Pamphlets and penny dreadfuls sensationalized her story, turning her into a figure of both horror and fascination. Mothers across the country clutched their babies tighter, whispering prayers that such evil would never walk the earth again. And yet, for all the outrage, for all the shock, one question lingered like a shadow. How many were there? How many tiny lives had Amelia Dyer stolen, one by one, wrapping them in tape and dropping them into the dark waters of the Thames? The official answer would never come. Some said a dozen. Others swore it was hundreds. Amelia took the truth to the grave, leaving behind only speculation and sorrow. But one thing was certain: her name would live on as a symbol of unspeakable wickedness, a warning of what can happen when desperation meets greed, when trust falls into the wrong hands, and when evil wears the mask of kindness. The ad went out, and the waiting began. Days passed with no reply. Then, just when Anderson began to fear the plan had failed, a letter arrived. The handwriting was neat, almost prim. The tone was warm, reassuring. It said everything a frightened mother would want to hear. It promised kindness. It promised care. It was signed Mrs. Harding. But Anderson knew exactly who it was. The spider had answered the call of the web. Arrangements were made for a meeting. Amelia believed she was about to secure another adoption, another payment, another victim. But as she walked toward the agreed location, clutching her handbag, she had no idea that plainclothes officers were watching her every step. She walked into the trap without hesitation, her bonnet neatly tied, her face calm. She had done this hundreds of times before. Why should this time be any different? The moment Amelia introduced herself, the officers moved in. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She simply stared at them with those cold, unreadable eyes, as if she had always known this day would come. They searched her handbag, and what they found confirmed everything. Inside was white tape, the same kind used on the babies, the same mark of death. Amelia Dyer was arrested on April 3, 1896. The news spread like wildfire. Crowds gathered outside the police station, straining to catch a glimpse of the woman who had haunted the rivers. Reporters swarmed the scene, their pens flying as they described her in lurid detail. A stout, pale woman with sharp eyes. The baby butcher of Reading. The nation was transfixed. How could a woman, a mother herself, commit such unspeakable crimes? How many babies had she killed? The number whispered in the newspapers grew with each passing day. 50, 100, 200, 400. No one knew for certain, and perhaps no one ever would. While Amelia sat in her cell, calm and silent, the police began the grim task of searching her home. What they found defied imagination. The stench was overpowering. Officers gagged as they opened boxes and trunks, pulling out tiny garments, booties, bonnets, all neatly folded, all belonging to children who would never wear them again. They found letters from mothers, heartbreaking letters filled with hope and trust. One read, "Please take care of my little one. I cannot keep her, but I want her to be safe." Another said, "I will send more money as soon as I can." The voices of the dead cried out from every scrap of paper. And then there were the drugs, bottles of laudanum and Godfrey's cordial, the opium mixtures once used to keep babies quiet. These were the tools of her trade, as much a part of her killing as the white tape. But the most chilling detail was not what they found. It was what they couldn't. There were no graves, no remains, only the letters and the clothes, mute testimony to lives that had vanished without a trace. The case against Amelia was ironclad. The tape in her bag, the letters in her home, the bodies in the river, all of it pointed to one conclusion. She was a killer. Not just any killer, but perhaps the most prolific in British history. Yet even now, sitting in her cell, Amelia gave nothing away. When asked why she did it, she shrugged. When asked how many, she refused to answer. It was as if she held her secrets tightly to the end, letting the world wonder. But soon, the wondering would be over. The trial was set, the gallows were waiting, and Amelia Dyer, who had lived in darkness for so long, was about to face the light. When Amelia Dyer was brought to trial in June of 1896, the entire nation seemed to hold its breath. The courtroom in Reading was packed beyond capacity. Lawyers, reporters, members of the public all jostled for space, desperate to witness the woman who had been dubbed the baby butcher. The air was thick with tension, a mixture of outrage and morbid curiosity. This was no ordinary trial. This was a reckoning. From the moment Amelia entered the courtroom, all eyes locked on her. She wore a plain black dress, her bonnet pulled low, her face pale and expressionless. There was no sign of fear, no hint of remorse. She walked with the calmness of someone heading to a tea party, not the gallows. When the clerk read out the charges, murder, willful murder, the killing of helpless infants, she stood silently, her hands folded neatly before her, as though these words were being spoken about someone else. The prosecution began by painting a picture so horrifying that some in the courtroom turned away in tears. They spoke of the discovery of baby bodies in the Thames, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, each with the same chilling signature, white tape wound tightly around the tiny neck. They described the evidence found in Amelia's home, the piles of baby clothes, the letters from desperate mothers, the drugs, the tape. What drove Amelia? Was it money alone, or something deeper, a twisted sense of power, a desire to play God? Some believe Amelia hated the mothers, saw them as sinners who deserved punishment. Others think she was simply cold, devoid of empathy, shaped by a childhood of suffering. Whatever the truth, by the time she reached her 50s, Amelia Dyer had become a machine of death, operating without conscience, killing baby after baby until the numbers defy belief. Some say 200, others say 400. No one knows for sure. And yet, for decades, no one stopped her. Society looked away. The shame of illegitimacy kept mothers silent. The lack of regulations left children unprotected. Even the law, when it caught her once, merely slapped her wrist and let her go. Amelia thrived in that darkness, feeding on the desperation of others, turning their hope into horror. But the darkness could not last forever. The Thames would betray her. The white tape, her trademark of death, would become her undoing. And as the walls closed in, the nation would come to know her name and tremble at the thought that such evil could wear the face of an ordinary woman. By the spring of 1896, Amelia Dyer was running out of time, and she didn't even know it. For decades, she had operated in the shadows, moving from town to town, leaving behind a trail of death and despair. She believed she was untouchable. The law had failed to stop her before, and society's silence had been her greatest shield. But now, that shield was cracking. The Thames had given up her secret, and with it came the beginning of her end. When the small brown parcel was pulled from the river and opened, revealing the lifeless body of a baby girl, the Reading police understood immediately that this was no accident. The child was wrapped too neatly, too deliberately. And then there was the tape. White dressmaker's tape wound tightly around the tiny neck. This was no natural death. This was murder. Detective Constable James Anderson was assigned to the case, and he approached it with grim determination. He had seen death before, but something about this crime chilled him to the bone. The innocence of the victim, the calculated nature of the act. It was evil in its purest form. Anderson examined the wrapping paper carefully, noting every detail. Then he saw it. Faint, almost smudged, but still readable. A name. An address. Mrs. Thomas. The clue led the detectives to a modest house in Kensington Road, Caversham. When they knocked on the door, the woman who answered looked ordinary, matronly, calm, unremarkable. She introduced herself as Mrs. Thomas, a widow. Her real name, of course, was Amelia Dyer. The detectives spoke to her politely, asking routine questions, pretending they were conducting a simple inquiry. But as they looked around the room, the smell hit them, sour, pungent, unmistakable, the smell of death. Amelia noticed their faces change, and for the first time, a flicker of fear passed through her eyes. She invited them in, trying to appear cooperative, but it was too late. The detectives were already cataloging the details. Piles of baby clothes, feeding bottles, letters from mothers, and most disturbing of all, the white tape. That same tape found on the baby in the river was here, sitting on Amelia's sewing table, as innocent-looking as any household item. But in this house, it was an instrument of death. The officers left that day without arresting her. They needed more evidence, something that would tie Amelia to the murders beyond doubt. So they began watching her, day and night, hoping she would slip, hoping she would reveal just how deep the darkness ran. Meanwhile, the Thames kept telling its gruesome story. Over the next few weeks, more parcels were discovered, each containing the body of a child, each wrapped in paper and tied with string, and always the white tape. The newspapers caught wind of the story and began printing shocking headlines. Baby killer on the loose. Who is the monster of the Thames? The public was horrified. Mothers clutched their children tighter. People whispered in the streets, who could do such a thing? And worse, how many babies were out there, hidden beneath the waters? The pressure on the police grew. They needed to act fast before Amelia disappeared again. She was clever, and she had a history of changing names and towns whenever suspicion arose. If she sensed danger, she would vanish, and the trail would go cold. Anderson knew they had only one chance to catch her, and so they devised a plan. A trap. The idea was simple, but risky. The detectives would place a fake advertisement in the local newspaper, pretending to be a mother seeking someone to adopt her baby. The ad would use the same language Amelia herself used: gentle, respectable, promising secrecy. If Amelia answered, they would lure her into a meeting and arrest her on the spot. Amelia, as the youngest daughter, became her mother's caretaker, witnessing scenes no child should ever see. Imagine the fear: a little girl holding down her mother during seizures, hearing her scream, watching her slip further away each day. Some say Amelia's hatred for weakness was born here, in that darkened house where illness and poverty walked hand in hand. When Sarah finally died, Amelia was just a teenager. The trauma of those years never left her. Perhaps it planted the first seeds of cruelty, or perhaps it simply taught her that life was harsh and merciless, a lesson she would later apply with terrifying precision. After her mother's death, Amelia's father eventually passed away too, leaving the children to fend for themselves. Amelia had to survive in a world that gave poor women few choices. She trained as an apprentice dressmaker, then as a nurse. Nursing gave her skills she would one day twist for evil. She learned how to care for the sick, how to handle babies, and, most importantly, how to earn trust. To those who knew her, Amelia seemed quiet, polite, even compassionate. No one saw the darkness growing inside her. But the Victorian world was a cruel place for women, especially those without money or a husband. Respectability was everything. A woman who fell from grace through poverty, scandal, or pregnancy was ruined for life. There was no welfare, no safety net. For unmarried mothers, the situation was desperate. If a domestic servant became pregnant, she lost her job. Families disowned daughters who bore illegitimate children. The shame was unbearable. Some women turned to workhouses, grim institutions where conditions were so brutal that many saw them as a slow death sentence. Others turned to something called baby farming. Baby farming was the ugly secret of Victorian England. It began as a seemingly charitable practice. A woman with means would take in the baby of an unmarried mother for a fee. Sometimes the arrangement was temporary until the mother could find work again. Other times, it was permanent, like an informal adoption. Ads appeared in newspapers every day. Respectable couple willing to adopt baby, nice home in the country. For desperate mothers, these ads seemed like salvation. They imagined their child safe in a warm home, loved and cared for, far from judgmental eyes. But the truth was darker. Many baby farmers had no intention of raising the children. They saw babies as a source of income. The mothers would pay a few pounds up front, then disappear, believing they had secured a future for their child. But once the money changed hands, the baby became a burden. Some baby farmers simply let the infants starve. Others drugged them with opium-laced syrups like Godfrey's cordial to keep them quiet until death came. In those days, infant mortality was high, so few questions were asked when babies died. It was the perfect crime, hiding in plain sight. Amelia Dyer discovered baby farming in the 1860s after she married a man named George Thomas. He was much older than her, by 35 years, and their marriage was strange from the start. George soon died, leaving Amelia a widow with no steady income. For a while, she worked as a nurse, but the pay was meager. Then she met a woman who introduced her to the baby farming trade, and Amelia saw opportunity. It began as a way to make money, but greed, and something darker, soon took over. At first, Amelia may have intended to find homes for the babies, but it didn't take long for her to realize that there was no profit in honesty. Why bother finding a home when she could simply take the money and dispose of the child? Starvation was common. But Amelia grew impatient. She didn't want to wait for death. She wanted control, swift, absolute control. And so, the killings began. Amelia's method was chilling in its simplicity. She would take the baby from its mother, offer words of comfort, perhaps even a smile. Then, when she was alone, she would reach for the white tape. It became her signature, a length of dressmaker's tape wrapped tightly around the tiny neck. There was no struggle, no noise. The child could not cry out. Death came silently, efficiently. To Amelia, it was just business. Over the years, Amelia perfected her system. She moved often, changing names to avoid suspicion. She advertised under aliases: Mrs. Harding, Mrs. Smith, Mrs. Thomas. Each time, the pattern was the same: an ad in the paper, a desperate mother, a bundle of money, and then silence. She even served a short prison term for neglect in the 1870s, but it didn't stop her. If anything, it made her more careful, more cunning. She began using rivers to dispose of bodies, wrapping them in brown paper and string, weighting them down before casting them into the water. The Thames, the Avon, and other rivers became her graveyards. The trial began on May 22, 1896, at the Old Bailey in London. The courtroom was packed with reporters, lawyers, and members of the public who had traveled for miles just to see the woman who had become a national scandal. Amelia sat in the dock, her face pale and expressionless. She wore a simple black dress and a white bonnet. To some, she looked like a grandmother. To others, she looked like the very embodiment of evil. But what struck everyone was her calmness. There were no tears, no visible signs of guilt, only a cold acceptance of her fate. The prosecution presented its case with brutal clarity. They showed the jury the letters Amelia had received from desperate mothers. They read aloud her own words from the ads she placed in newspapers, ads that promised kindness and security while hiding a deadly lie. They brought forward the gruesome evidence, the parcels from the Thames, the tiny corpses, the white tape. And then they presented the most damning testimony of all, Amelia's own confession. When the jury heard her statement about the tape, there was a collective gasp in the courtroom. It was a moment that froze time. This was not the slip of a guilty woman. It was the proud, almost boastful remark of someone who had grown used to killing without consequence. For years, Amelia had held the power of life and death in her hands, and now, for the first time, that power was gone. The defense tried to argue that Amelia was insane, that no sane woman could commit such atrocities. They spoke of her childhood, her mother's mental illness, the hardships of poverty. They painted a picture of a woman driven to madness by circumstance, but it was too little, too late. The jury was not moved. They saw not a mad woman, but a murderer who had built a business out of death. The verdict came quickly. After only 4.5 minutes of deliberation, a time so short it shocked even seasoned lawyers, the jury returned with a single word: guilty. The courtroom erupted. Some people cheered. Others wept. Amelia sat still, her face as cold as stone. When the judge asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, Amelia replied softly, "I have nothing to say." And with that, the judge pronounced the sentence, death by hanging. The execution was scheduled for June 10, 1896, at Newgate Prison. In the weeks leading up to it, Amelia was kept under close watch. Authorities feared she might take her own life before the law could. But Amelia showed no signs of despair. She wrote letters, read the Bible, and spoke little. There were no dramatic outbursts, no pleas for mercy. It was as if she had accepted her fate from the moment the handcuffs closed around her wrists. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, the case continued to dominate headlines. People could not stop talking about it. How had this gone on for so long? How had so many babies vanished without anyone noticing? The public demanded changes, and those changes would come, but too late for the hundreds of innocent children who had already perished. On the morning of her execution, Amelia Dyer walked calmly to the gallows. She was 58 years old. The executioner placed the rope around her neck, adjusted the knot, and pulled the lever. At 9 a.m., Amelia Dyer, the most prolific baby killer in British history, was dead. It was over, at least for her. But for the families of those lost children, the pain would never end. Yet even in death, Amelia's story did not fade. It raised questions that still haunt us today. How could society allow this? Why were women so desperate that they would hand over their babies to strangers? And what does this say about the dark corners of human nature, where profit and survival can outweigh even the most sacred bond of all, the bond between mother and child? Long before Amelia Dyer became the most notorious baby farmer in British history, she was just a little girl growing up in a world full of shadows. To understand the monster she became, we must go back to the beginning, to the small village of Pile Marsh near Bristol in the year 1837. It was the same year Queen Victoria ascended the throne, ushering in an era of moral strictness and rigid social order. But for Amelia Hobley, as she was then known, life was anything but orderly. Amelia was the youngest of 5 children in a working-class family. Her father, Samuel Hobley, was a skilled shoemaker, a respectable trade, though far from wealthy. Her mother, Sarah, kept the home, raising the children as best she could. But behind closed doors, there was suffering that would leave scars on Amelia's soul. When Amelia was still young, her mother began to lose her mind. In an age before modern medicine, mental illness was poorly understood and rarely treated. Amelia watched as her mother descended into madness, consumed by violent fits and uncontrollable outbursts. There were no hospitals for women like Sarah, only the home where family members had to bear the burden. Amelia thrived in that silence, but now the silence was broken. Detectives began tracking Amelia's financial records, the letters, and her movements over the years. They discovered that Amelia had placed newspaper ads offering adoption services. Her ads sounded so kind, so maternal. A respectable married couple desires to adopt a healthy child. Nice country home. That was the bait. And the mothers, believing they were saving their babies, sent them away, forever. Meanwhile, Amelia herself was trying to stay one step ahead. She sensed the net closing in. She destroyed papers, burned evidence, and even wrote letters to friends, hinting that she might do something drastic. In one letter, she wrote that she could not face another term in prison. She knew what was coming, and for the first time, fear touched her heart. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when an undercover operation was set up. Detectives placed a fake ad, pretending to be a mother looking for someone to take her baby. Amelia answered. She agreed to meet, just as she had done so many times before. But this time, the woman she was meeting was working with the police. On April 3, 1896, Amelia Dyer was arrested. When the officers entered her house, the horror was overwhelming. The smell of decay, the piles of baby clothes, the letters, all of it told a story of systematic, cold-blooded killing. And yet Amelia remained calm. She knew the game was over. As the police questioned her, the scale of her crimes began to emerge. How many babies had she killed? Dozens, hundreds. Amelia never gave a clear number. Some historians believe it could have been as many as 400. If true, that would make her one of the most prolific serial killers in history. But even if the number was smaller, the brutality was the same. Each child was a life, a future stolen for a handful of pounds. When the news broke, the nation was stunned. Victorian England prided itself on morality and family values, yet here was a woman who had turned motherhood into a business of death. The newspapers couldn't print enough stories. Crowds gathered outside the police station, screaming for justice. Mothers who had given babies to Amelia came forward, their grief spilling into the open, and the law prepared to make an example of her. Amelia was charged with murder, not for all the babies, but for one. Just one case the baby found in the Thames with her name on the wrapping paper. The law didn't need hundreds of charges. One was enough to hang her. But the trial would reveal even more darkness, and Amelia's own words would chill the courtroom to silence. The arrest of Amelia Dyer sent shockwaves through Victorian England. For decades, she had walked among ordinary people, hiding in plain sight, carrying out a trade so dark that even hardened detectives were left stunned. Now, the world wanted answers. How had she done it? Why had no one stopped her? And most importantly, how many innocent lives had been lost? After her arrest on April 3, 1896, Amelia was taken to the Reading police station. There, officers questioned her for hours. At first, she tried to maintain her composure. She was calm, almost indifferent, as if she believed she could still find a way out. But the evidence against her was overwhelming. The letters, the parcels pulled from the Thames, the white tape, all of it pointed to a monstrous truth. Amelia knew the game was over, and so, in a moment that would horrify the world, she confessed. Amelia's confession was brief, cold, and shocking. She admitted to killing babies, but she did not show remorse. She spoke of them as if they were objects, not human beings. In one chilling line, she reportedly said, "You'll know all mine by the tape around their necks." Those words would echo through the courtroom when her trial began, a haunting reminder of the calculated cruelty that defined her crimes. As the news spread, the newspapers went wild. Every detail of Amelia Dyer's life was laid bare. They called her the baby butcher, the angel of death, and the worst woman in Britain. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse every day, shouting for justice. People could not believe that such evil had been hiding behind the face of an ordinary nurse. Mothers wept openly in the streets, thinking of their own children and the horror those tiny souls had endured. But here is the most unsettling part. The law could not charge Amelia with 400 murders. In those days, the justice system worked differently. Prosecutors focused on one solid case, the baby girl found in the Thames, identified as Helena Fry. That single murder charge was enough to bring the death penalty. There was no need to prove the rest, though the evidence suggested a scale of killing almost beyond comprehension. By the 1890s, Amelia's activities had escalated beyond comprehension. Authorities believe she killed as many as 400 infants, making her one of the most prolific serial killers in history. But for years, she operated almost without fear. The system was broken. There were few records, no official oversight, and almost no protection for children. It was the perfect environment for someone like Amelia to thrive. However, no killer can hide forever. In 1896, a gruesome discovery would set in motion the chain of events that brought Amelia Dyer to justice. It began with a package floating in the Thames River, a small brown parcel tied with string. When the authorities pulled it from the water and opened it, what they found inside was the tiny body of a baby girl. She was wrapped in paper, and the paper had a name and address: Mrs. Thomas, an alias used by Amelia Dyer. This single mistake, this tiny piece of evidence, would unravel the life of a woman who had lived in darkness for decades. The hunt for Amelia Dyer was about to begin, and the truth that would emerge would shock an entire nation. The year was 1896, and the River Thames had seen many secrets, but none as terrible as the ones it was about to reveal. On March 30th, a bargeman spotted a small, tightly wrapped parcel drifting near Reading. It seemed ordinary enough. Victorian England was full of discarded packages, but something about it caught his attention. Perhaps it was the unusual shape, or maybe just an instinct. He hauled it from the water, unwrapped the brown paper, and discovered a horrifying truth: the body of a baby girl. The child was wrapped carefully, as if someone had taken great care to hide her. Around her tiny neck was a piece of white tape. This was no accident, no natural death. The tape was tied tightly, suggesting deliberate strangulation. For the authorities, this was shocking, but what came next would shock them even more. Inside the wrappings, they found something that should never have been there. A faint trace of handwriting. An address. A name. Mrs. Thomas. This was the clue that would crack open one of the darkest cases in British history. The police launched an investigation immediately. They began tracing the name Mrs. Thomas, following the faint breadcrumbs of ink. Their search led them to a quiet house in Caversham, near Reading, where a seemingly ordinary woman lived, a widow named Amelia Dyer. At least that's who she appeared to be. But the deeper they looked, the more they realized nothing about Amelia was ordinary. When investigators approached the house, the smell hit them first. It was foul, unmistakable, the stench of death. The neighbors had noticed it too, but had assumed it was from the drains or perhaps dead rats. But the police knew better. They searched the property and found a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Inside Amelia's home, there were piles of baby clothes, letters from desperate mothers, and countless items that told a story of trust betrayed and innocence destroyed. One of the most chilling discoveries was the sheer number of letters Amelia kept. These were not love letters nor friendly notes. They were pleas. Letters from young women begging Amelia to take care of their babies. Letters filled with hope, desperation, and fear. Some mothers wrote that they couldn't afford to pay much. Others promised they would send more money later. Each letter was a reminder of a life handed over, never to return. As the police dug deeper, they learned that Amelia had been operating under multiple names. Mrs. Thomas was just one of her many aliases. Over the years, she had moved from town to town, changing her identity each time suspicion grew. She was clever, resourceful, and cold. She knew how to avoid the law, and she had done so for decades. In fact, this was not the first time Amelia had been in trouble. Back in 1879, nearly 20 years earlier, Amelia had actually been caught for neglecting children in her care. She was sentenced to 6 months of hard labor. 6 months, that was all. No real investigation, no deeper punishment. After her release, she simply started again. The system had failed to stop her, and countless babies paid the price. The investigation widened. The Thames began to give up more of its secrets. Over the next few weeks, police found dozens of tiny bodies, each wrapped in similar paper, each with that same white tape around the neck. The newspapers erupted with horror. Headlines screamed of the baby butcher, and the public demanded answers. How could such evil exist in plain sight? How could no one have noticed for so long? Part of the answer lay in Victorian society itself. People did not like to talk about illegitimacy. It was a taboo subject. Families would rather pretend nothing happened than face the shame. So, when a young woman's baby disappeared, no one asked questions. The mothers were too afraid to speak, and the law did not care enough to look. In the late 19th century, during the Victorian era, England was a place of rapid industrial growth, poverty, and desperation. It was an age where society placed heavy moral expectations on women, particularly those who found themselves unmarried and pregnant. For these women, life could turn into a nightmare. Respectability meant everything in Victorian society, and an illegitimate child could ruin a woman's entire life. Jobs would vanish, families would disown them, and survival would become nearly impossible. And that fear, the fear of shame, created a dark opportunity for people like Amelia Dyer. Amelia Dyer did not look like a monster. In fact, she appeared to be an ordinary middle-aged woman. She wore plain clothes, spoke politely, and gave the impression of someone who wanted to help struggling mothers. She introduced herself as a caring figure, someone who could offer a solution when the world had turned its back on them. To desperate women, she seemed like an angel of mercy. But in reality, Amelia Dyer was something far more sinister. She was a predator who turned motherhood into a business and then into something even darker. This story begins with the cruel realities of Victorian society. At that time, there were no welfare systems, no government support for single mothers. If a young woman became pregnant and the father refused to marry her, her life would fall apart. Many worked as domestic servants, and an unmarried pregnancy almost always meant losing the job. Homelessness and starvation often followed, so some women turned to something called baby farming. It sounds strange today, but in that era, baby farming was a common practice. Wealthier families would sometimes adopt illegitimate children, and women like Amelia offered to arrange such adoptions for a fee. At first, baby farming might have sounded like an act of kindness. A struggling mother could pay a small amount, and a woman like Amelia would take the baby and find a good home for it. That was the promise, but the reality was horrifying. Many so-called baby farmers were not placing babies into loving families at all. They were neglecting them, starving them, and in some cases, killing them. And among all the baby farmers of Victorian England, Amelia Dyer became the most infamous. Amelia was born in 1837 in a small village in Bristol. She was the youngest of 5 children, and from an early age, she witnessed suffering. Her mother developed mental illness and died when Amelia was still young. This experience might have shaped her in ways we can only guess. After her mother's death, Amelia trained as a nurse, learning basic medical care. For a time, she seemed like any other working-class woman trying to survive in a hard world. But in the shadows of her ordinary life, something dark was growing. By the early 1860s, Amelia had discovered baby farming. She realized there was money to be made from desperate mothers. Women would pay her to take their babies and promise them a better life. The payments were often just a few pounds, a huge amount for a poor servant girl, but not much compared to the value of her child's life. Amelia would take the baby, tell the mother that the child would be safe, and then the child would vanish. At first, Amelia might have tried to place babies with adoptive families, but soon she found that there was an easier way to make money without the effort of actually finding homes. She could take the baby, pocket the money, and then simply let the baby die. Starvation was the common method. Baby farmers would drug infants with something called Godfrey's cordial, a mixture of alcohol and opium, to keep them quiet and sleepy. These babies would be fed less and less until they wasted away. The death would appear natural. Victorian England had high infant mortality rates, so no one asked too many questions. The system allowed this cruelty to hide in plain sight. But Amelia didn't stop there. Over time, she became colder, more ruthless. Instead of letting the babies die slowly, she began to kill them outright. Some reports suggest strangulation. Others mention using white tape to tie around the babies' necks, a chilling detail that would later become important evidence. To Amelia, this was business. Each child was just another transaction. Imagine the scene. A young woman, shamed by society, terrified of being discovered, meets Amelia in a small, stuffy room. Amelia smiles, speaks softly, and says she understands. She promises to give the baby a good home, far away from gossip and disgrace. The mother feels relief as she hands over her child, believing she has saved its future. She walks away with tears in her eyes, never knowing that her baby will not live to see another sunrise.